Mari McInerney from Croaky here, and I'm talking to Cath Roper, who just won the Lifetime Achievement Award at the VMIAC Awards. And you are very famed in the area for the research work you've done and your academic involvement in sort of educating the healthcare system, really, around mental health. What did the award mean to you, and what's brought you to this moment?
Oh goodness, it was and is a very humbling and very overwhelming thing to be, I think, particularly because it's a room full of peers, so people that you've known and worked with for many years, and people who have put their heart and souls into trying to make things better for people who use mental health services, or for people who experience distress or really difficult times. And although I did have some pre-warning that the award was going to be given, it's still I think very, very overwhelming. And I noticed that all of us who were lucky enough to be awarded by our peers all felt the same, that it's an effort by everybody, and what was lovely is having everyone together. I think that we are a collective, we are a movement, and I think that sense was really strong in the room, that these are people who've worked often, I was going to say tirelessly. It's true, it's tireless, it's often thankless, it's often invisible, not seen. Some people work for nothing. I'm really lucky in that I do get a wage for what I do. And yes, what I do is around research and education and training. So I teach mental health nurses a subject all about consumer perspective, which includes things like the consumer movement and how it started, and that it was civil rights based. And we go through things like human rights, as opposed to the rights that people get under the Mental Health Act. So a lot of the nurses that I work with, actually their work is working under a whole separate piece of legislation, and that's very difficult for them and for the consumers who have to go to hospital and often experience interventions like seclusion and restraint. Now, I personally did also experience seclusion and restraint, so I feel like that gives that's something that I've never forgotten. It's something that has influenced all the work that I do subsequently and have done.
How has it influenced?
So, seclusion is when you're locked into a room where you can't escape, and there's no. This is my experience from the sort of 80s and early 90s, and you. There's nothing in there. I've been in situations where it wasn't even a bedpan, so I had to defecate in this room, and then of course that is totally undignifying and humiliating. I'm not the only person who would have experienced that kind of situation where that's clearly against human rights. You don't, in prisons, not put someone in a room like that and not have facilities so that they can go to the toilet and so on. And I think psychologically, it's very upsetting, because there's no stimulus at all, and that means you're left with your own. If you hear voices, you're left with your own voices, or if you are very disturbed, which I was, you're just left with that, and there's no one to help you. You're isolated. So it's a practice that, fortunately, these days we're really keen to not just reduce but actually eliminate. So this is something that we no longer want people to be going through.
I think most people would think it doesn't happen anymore.
It certainly does. It does, and so does restraint. And although I was never restrained personally, I think there are many forms of restraint. We talk about chemical restraint, which is where people are over-medicated so that they're, I guess, more docile, I guess. There's physical restraint, and hands-on, where someone is put in a takedown so that they're put on the floor, and often that's the beginning part before an episode of seclusion. So you get someone sort of, or on their bed, So that might be 5 people, sort of a code grey is called, and 5 people will rush to that, to you, and then sort of, kind of incapacitate you and inject you with an injection that will perhaps put you to sleep. So these are practices that we know are kind of, in other circumstances, would be assaults and violations, but these are put across as for our own health. So there's a certain dissonance around saying to someone, this is for your own good. These practices are actually experienced very violently on the body. So it's against the integrity of your body if you're going to forcibly inject someone against their will, for instance. So these are experiences that I've had which have caused me to think a lot about what it means ethically and kind of from a human rights perspective to experience these things, to know that it doesn't feel right, and to want to keep people thinking about it. So rather than taking a human rights advocacy perspective, I guess I've taken the pen, or worked with a lot of amazing people who are similarly committed to the same sorts of things, like eliminating seclusion and restraint, or bringing it onto the agenda research-wise.
And how have you done that?
Well, again, it's been people coming to me and creating opportunities, and I guess you get a profile.
But what sort of work? Like, what have you looked at?
So seclusion and restraint, the elimination and reduction of that has been a significant piece of work that I was involved with. Other projects would be, I guess, I'm just trying to think what else I've done with research. I think my mind's a little bit blank.
Everyone talked about the collaborative approach that you bring to it.
Yeah.
They said that you could just go off and do this stuff because you're so smart and you know what you're doing, but that what you really bring to it is to trying to change practice. And Bernadette McSherry talked in her tribute to you about how you've helped her change language and things like that. Do you think it's very important to work like that?
I think there's something to be said for people who are on the very edge, who are on the very cusp of saying things no one wants to hear. And they're the ones who often get burnt alive and who often end up not getting awards. But then I think, and I'm really, really mindful of the myriad people who've played roles like that and it's been thankless. But in my heart, I know that there are lots of people, who I would like to, thank and do thank, and sort of that kind of thing.
Are you thinking yourself on the edge in that way? Or
I think I have pushed a wedge, but I'm thinking of other people who really have, you lose jobs when you push to a certain extremity. But I think we need people like that. I'm not one of them now, or I probably haven't been one of them. But I do push as far as I can, and I've certainly, my students have always known that that I actually think we would be an interesting world we lived in if we didn't have mental health legislation, separate legislation that only governs people who've got what's known as a mental illness, where I actually think what we, many of us contribute, we face our own demons, we experience things that people don't normally experience, and I think we have a wealth of, we know things in a certain way. I'm not saying we're all the same by any means, but I think if we lived in a world that was really open to different ways of knowing, different ways of being, I think it would be a much, much nicer place to live in, and much less shame, because I actually think it's shame that is the most destructive thing that we have. To me, that's the destructive thing. And the thing about discrimination is that it takes shame and blows it up, and but it would, they're friends, shame and discrimination.
How would you, because you talked about that in your speech, about having something very special, but you said also something very useful to give to the world, your perspective. How would you like to see it received? What would be?
I just think everyone would feel a lot better if you didn't have to be logical, if you didn't have to be, if we weren't all sort of like bowed down by rationality. You know, I think it's not, I'm not saying rationality and logic are unnecessary, they are. But they're not the whole story. There is much more. There is, you know, there are many ways to know things, and I think, you know, it would be great to be in a world where, you know, that wasn't odd. It wasn't odd if, you know, if I thought of, you know, if there was a friendly little gremlin just, you know, sort of standing there in front of the lift, or what's to be worried about? Clearly, when someone's, you know, when people are distressed, then what should arise in us is a feeling of compassion. The fact that doesn't happen means it's not as much of a world that I like living in. You know, like, I do want to live in a world when people are compassionate, very curious about others, open to different ways of knowing, different ways of being. That's the world I'd, you know, most like to live in. Yeah.
I'd like to live there with you. Thank you very much, Cath.